There was a man named George. He lived in a small town with his wife, Elizabeth, and their only son, Harry. Harry was in 6th grade. He was one of the brightest students in his class. His teachers always praised him, and he never failed to impress them. His best friend, Louis, was a very sensible boy. George made a living by buying and selling used items. Every day, he walked from door to door, collecting old newspapers, magazines, empty bottles, and other discarded things. But Harry didn't like his father's work. He never spoke about it at school. He feared his classmates would laugh at him. Only Louis knew the truth. He always told Harry that his father was hardworking and honest.
You should be proud,
he would say. But Harry refused to listen. One morning after breakfast, Harry grabbed his bag and headed to school. George took his carriage and went to work. At one house, a woman handed him old newspapers, bottles, and a storybook. George checked the items and said,
"I will give you $3.
The woman nodded, and he paid her. As he placed the items in his carriage, his eyes fell on the storybook. He smiled and thought,
Harry loves stories. He will be so happy to get this."
At another house, a man stepped out with a bundle of old newspapers to sell. His son stood beside him. George checked the weight and said,
"I will give you $2 for these."
The man agreed, and George paid him. As George loaded the papers, the boy pointed at the book.
Dad. Please buy me this.
The man asked.
How much?
George shook his head with a smile.
"Sorry. This isn't for sale."
In the afternoon, a woman passed by George's carriage and stopped. She pointed at the empty bottles.
I need 3 to store my homemade ketchup and sauces. How much?
$3.
George said. She nodded, handed over the money, picked up the bottles, and left. In the evening, George went to a junk dealer and showed his items. The dealer inspected them and set some aside.
I can't take these. For the rest, I will give you $40.
George hesitated for a moment. Then he agreed, took the money, and headed home with his carriage. At night, George reached home. Elizabeth opened the door and went to the kitchen. He set the carriage aside, took out the storybook, and entered the room. Feeling exhausted, he placed the book on the table and went to freshen up. After a while, he stepped out of the bathroom and sat in the lounge. A moment later, Elizabeth brought water and handed it to George. George drank the water and called,
Harry! Harry!
Harry came out of his room, and George handed him the book. Harry grabbed it, sat beside him, and shouted with joy.
Oh, Dad! I love it!
George smiled.
I knew you would love it.
Harry hugged him.
Thank you, Dad.
Elizabeth smiled.
But read after dinner and homework.
Harry smiled.
Of course. Mom.
One evening, George reached the junk dealer and handed over his items. The dealer inspected them and set aside torn newspapers, damp magazines, and cracked bottles.
These are in bad condition. I can't take them. I will give you $30 for the rest.
George frowned.
That's too low.
The junk dealer shook his head.
Take it or leave it.
With no choice, George accepted the money and walked home sadly. That night, George ate in silence. Elizabeth noticed and said,
Take more, dear.
Enough.
George said softly and went to his room. Harry kept eating while Elizabeth lost her appetite. She got up, made tea, poured it into 2 cups, and went to the room. She handed George a cup. Then she sat beside him.
You look so worried.
George sighed.
Elizabeth. I didn't get a proper education. Now I do this work. Harry doesn't like it. And when I get paid so little, it hurts even more.
Elizabeth patted his shoulder.
Don't worry, my dear. Soon, our son will grow up and get a good job.
George smiled and started sipping his tea. One Sunday, George set his carriage and headed to the flea market. Customers started to come, buying newspapers, torn magazines, and bottles. Soon, everything was sold. While counting his money, he saw a second-hand shirt and jeans. He approached the stall and asked,
How much?
Just $2.
The stall owner said. He bought them and went home. After dinner, he handed the clothes to Harry.
I bought these for you.
Harry was shocked and then shouted,
How can I wear second-hand clothes? I only need new ones.
He threw them aside and ran inside. George stood in shock. Elizabeth patted his hand and said,
Don't worry, dear.
His face fell, and he walked to his room. One evening, as George was passing by houses, a boy came out with empty bottles and handed them to him. Suddenly, the boy asked.
Uncle. Are you Harry's father?
George smiled.
Yes.
After paying him, he moved ahead. Robert smirked.
Oh. So Harry's father is a junk collector. Interesting.
The next morning, he told the class.
Harry's dad is a junk collector.
Harry felt ashamed and lowered his head. Most classmates laughed, but Lewis scolded.
So what? He is a hard-working man. He is really nice, and that's what matters.
Soon, the teacher arrived. And the class fell silent. However, many were still smiling. During recess, Lewis said,
Harry, don't take it to heart. Just focus on your studies.
but Harry was disheartened. On returning home, Harry asked,
Mom, why doesn't Dad do another job?
Elizabeth sighed.
It needs money. Dear.
My classmates found out Dad is a junk collector. I won't go to that school anymore.
Harry said, and he ran to his room. That night, Elizabeth told George. He tried talking to Harry, but he refused to listen. The next morning, Harry stayed in bed. With a heavy heart, George left for work. In the evening, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth opened the door. Lewis stood there.
Hi, Aunt. Why didn't Harry come to school?
You know. Dear.
She sighed.
I will talk to him.
Lewis said and went to Harry's room. Harry was lying in bed. Lewis sat beside him.
Your father works hard for you. Don't waste it. Focus on your studies.
Harry understood and nodded. One day, a woman sold George an old box with a lock. He paid her and left. On the way, another woman saw it and bought it. The next day, as George passed by, she came and returned the box.
I can't open the lock. This is useless. Please return my money.
With a heavy heart, George paid her back and moved on. That evening, he sold the box to the junk dealer. The next evening, the junk dealer returned the box.
I can't open the lock. Take it back.
George took it and refunded the money. After selling his items, he went home. At home, he broke the lock. Suddenly, they saw a diamond inside. Harry shouted.
Oh, Dad! It's a diamond! Now you can start your shop.
George sighed.
It's not ours. We must return it.
Harry's face fell. And Elizabeth sighed. The next day, he went to the house. But a new family lived there. The neighbors didn't know where the old owners had gone. George returned home.
I have decided to sell it and start work. If the owner appears, I will repay them.
Harry was thrilled. Elizabeth smiled.
I think this is God's help.
George nodded with a smile. Moral: honesty and hard work always bring true success.